Before we get started into the review, I just want to show you why I can't stand playing this VR. And this isn't going to affect the review, it's just going to show you why I detest it now in Aerialistic, and it's because of one plane, the BV-238. It has been ridiculous for years now, and nothing has ever been done about it. If people want to talk about overpowered aircraft, the BV is the most overpowered in the game. I'll eventually do a video on it, but anyway, enjoy the video. Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're back in War Thunder and it's time to look at the Martlet Mk IV. Now if you don't know what the Martlet Mk IV is, well it's the plane that you can get from doing the old Operation Summer event and actually completing, I believe it was, 5 tasks from the pilot's marks of distinction. If you don't know anything about that, please go back about a week or two where I made a video on it and then that'll give you all of the information. So this is the first prize that you can get for the pilot side of things. It is a British battle rating 2.7 rank 2 premium aircraft and you can find it in the tree right here. It is the same BR as your early tier Spitfires, the 2A and the 1A, and very close to the 2B. Same BR, of course, as the Typhoon Mark 1A, so it's got some steep competition. Even the old D520 and D521 share the same bracket. So what is this? Well, the best way to describe it is it's a British-American F4. Very similar to it in flight characteristics, but of course you get some interesting camouflages with it, and also it has that wonderful premium bonus. It also has 6 12.7mm M2 Browning machine guns that you can find in the wings here. A total of 1,440 rounds, which is impressive and means that you can at least carry games from the ammunition point of view. This thing's made of fuel tanks in the bottom below the pilot, self-sealing, which is nice. You have the oil cooling system here, and then you have the Wright Cyclone R1820 49-cylinder radial, and of course the cooling type is air, which is why we have no liquid cooling system in this plane, just a bunch of oil cooling systems that you can see. But with the fact that the 6 Browning machine guns are sat on the wings, convergence is going to be something you're going to have to make sure to get sorted. So none of this central mounted stuff, all in the wings at this point. And the armor, well, the armor is designed to try and keep the pilot alive. 38mm on the front, 8mm behind, and then a 6mm behind the booty of the pilot. One of the things that is also nice about the Martlet is it gets this wonderful skin. This is the non-standard bicolor camouflage, but if you don't grind out the skin, if you want to just have the Martlet and not go on to get the FJ4B, this is the standard skin you'll get. Very British, very nice, very lovely. But I would definitely say it's worth getting the non-standard bicolor camouflage. With that said, because it's a premium vehicle, you get all of the modifications for free. There's not really much to write home about here, basically a bunch of just flight performance stuff, and then of course the belts for the offensive 12.7mm. The only thing you have to concern yourself with is the offensive 12.7mm. You start off with a pretty bad default belt, but because you get everything for free, you can choose anything you want off the bat. I personally like stealth rounds. The reason for this is if we look at Universal, there's a lot of AP, which does a decent amount of damage. Ground, once again, a lot of AP, good for ground realistic, if you like to pen stuff from the top, such as Panzer IVs. And then we have the tracer belts, which just don't go near. Unless you're really struggling with hitting targets, but I'd definitely say use tracers in a user mission or in a a custom battle, like if you go to test flights and then mission editor, use it here if you want to try and understand how to fire shots in this plane, because if you use the tracer belt, you're basically limiting yourself to every 4th round being actually useful. The reason I like stealth is because it's a good mix of AP and I, so you can set stuff on fire and at the same time you can put a hell of a lot of holes in stuff. It does mean that you obviously don't get a tracer shell, so you're going to have to get used to firing the 50 cals, the M2 Brownings, but you should be used to them by now as long as you've played a decent amount of America. They're pretty much on every American vehicle from rank 1 to rank 4, and therefore hopefully, you should be alright with it. One of the things that is missing modifications-wise, if we look at its counterpart, the F4, which is right here, at battle rating 2.7, this thing gets 2 100-pounders. Well, unfortunately, the Martlet is not able to get that. It doesn't have any secondary armament, so you have to just be sat with the 12.7s. Now, the 12.7s can pen 26mm. This is enough to pen the top of stuff like driver hatches on Panzer IVs. It is good enough to take out light targets, but of course against an enemy like the Russians or the Americans, you may struggle to pen the top of many of their tanks, meaning that you will be sat in much more of a fighter role if you decide to use this in ground realistic. And if you do want to use it in ground realistic, I mean, you do have some competition. The Typhoon Mark 1A I personally like, just because you can take the 2 500-pounders, but the Spitfire Mark 2A and Mark 1A, they don't have any secondaries either, so if you want something which is maybe a little bit more energy fightery at 2.7, and then at 2.7 you can run the Matilda, if you feel like it, the AC Mark II AA, and that's pretty much your lineup unless you have the Grant. So it's not that much of a powerful lineup. It's much better to get to the 3.3 lineup or even the 3.0. It's not great across the board, and also if you're running 3.0, then I would say take the Mark IIB Spitfire every time, and then maybe the Sea Hurricane for their extra biff baff bosh. And if you don't want to take that, if you have the Avenger, you can take that alongside. But yeah, there's much better options at 3.0. So if you are limited to 3.0, just take the Spitfire Mark IIB instead. The main thing I see from the Martlet is that it's going to be great for Silver Lions, getting Silver Lions at lower tiers. But if you are like me and you have pretty much all of the British tech tree, then it's not going to be great. So remember, since it's a rank 2, it will be good at researching rank 3, 2, and 1. So therefore, if you are starting in the British tech tree, or you're maybe in rank 2, this is going to be great for your grinding. But if you are a person who is past this, then this is just going to be one of those fun planes that you go back to, maybe with some squad mates, or maybe it's going to be something you're going to use to try and get some, as I said, Silver Lions in. What we're going to do is we're going to do a little history section, and then we'll get on to some gameplay. So I'll see you there. The Martlet has a very similar story to a bunch of planes we already have in game. The A-35B, the V-156, these aircraft were ordered by France and unfortunately didn't get there in time or didn't have enough impact, so therefore once France fell, the orders were given to Britain. So with this said, we're going to start off with the Mark I and move forward. So in 1939, Grumman received an order from the French for 81 aircraft with the model number G36A. These were to be used on some aircraft carriers that the French had. And the main difference between the G36, which is seen as the predecessor to stuff like the F4F, is the engine. The engine on the G36A was a single-row Wright R1820 G205A radial engine. It had 1200 horsepower and also a single-stage 2-speed supercharger. With this said, it also had a bunch of French instruments, which obviously makes sense. You want it to be as accommodating as possible, so it had radio and gun sights, which were French. The throttle was even turned around to make it very easy for French pilots to use. If you didn't know, something that is worth checking in all of the French aircraft, or at least a lot of them, which aren't just American-made, go and look at the throttle. It's what we would call reverse. If you actually move the lever towards the pilot, so backwards, it would increase engine power. Where the majority of aircraft in the day you pushed forward to increase engine power, the French decided that backwards was the way to go. The armament as well, for the French, they wanted 6 7.5 Dame machine guns, 2 in the fuselage, 4 in the wings, and the first of these G36As, the modified G36s, it was flown on the 11th of May in 1940. The issue with that is, well, France's defeat was at least around the corner, and because of the Battle of France being lost by France, all of the contracts were taken over by Britain. and the throttle was modified again. 4 50 cals were installed in the wings, and most of the traces of the original ownership removed. So what that means is the French instruments, the radio, and of course the gun sights, because obviously we British do it slightly differently. The Martlets were modified by Blackburn. If you don't know who Blackburn were, we don't actually have a lot of their aircraft in game. Hopefully we do with time to come. But they continued with modifying the later marks of the Martlet, so the Mark II to 5, and then British gun sights, catapult spools and other items were installed, and after attempts to fit British radio sets, it was decided to use the American equipment instead, because of a better fit. The first Martlets entered British service in August 1940, so around about half a year after they were ordered by the French, and 804 Naval Air Squadron, which was stationed in Hatston in the Orkney Islands, were the first to actually get them. The Martlet Mk I didn't have wing folding mechanisms and therefore was only used on land bases, and in 1940 Belgium also placed an order for about 10 of these Martlet Mk Is. They were modified with the removal of the tailhook, and after the surrender of Belgium, none were delivered, and by the 10th of May 1940 the aircraft order was once again transferred to the Royal Navy. So once again, the British taking the scraps off of the rest of the European nations which fell to the tyranny of Nazi Germany, and taking whatever they could get in whatever situation they could. So with that said, the probably predominant Martlet is the Mark II. This is the one that a lot of people... it would be very surprising if the Mark II doesn't make it in-game in some form or another. The only question is, will it be in the British tree or will it be in the American tree? And also, will the French get their own Martlets? I mean, technically there was a bunch made with the guns and also the instruments, so it would make sense to be able to see it. And from the logs that I've been looking at when we're talking about the Martlets Mark II, 3 and 4, what the pilots actually found from them was that when it came to the British counterparts, they were actually pretty much evenly matched. There was a lot of mock dogfights done between Hurricanes, submarine Spitfires, and Martlets, and what it was found was Hurricanes and Spitfire and submarine Spitfires were, submarine Spitfires were able to outmaneuver the Martlets after quite a long time, but eventually they would be able to outmaneuver them, but the Martlet would be able to get guns on target. But the Martlet was better at diving, and this was seen as a great advantage, and also its high-speed controllability was definitely loved by a lot of the pilots who flew it. And this progressed, of course, through the different stages of the Martlet, and it's one of those weird ones where the British pilots who actually flew it, when it came to the Martlet Mark I and II, it was actually seen as one of those aircraft which was quite hard to fly, or at least different compared to other aircraft. And one of the problems it had was actually landing, and that was because of the manual gears. It was also issues with the fact that you had to land without really being able to see the deck or anything like that, and you had to land at a decently high speed. And with that all said, the earlier versions were just for, as in quotations, experienced pilots when it came to the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. Now, when we moved to the Mark IV, there was a lot of preservations made, or reservations made, to make sure that these were much more comfortable for the average pilot, and therefore would be able to be much more useful for the average person. So the Martlet Mk IV, the Royal Navy purchased 220 F4 F4s, and they adapted them for the British, which makes sense. The main difference was the use of a Wright R1820-40B Cyclone in a distinctively more rounded and compact cowling, with a single double-wide flap on each side of the rear and no lip intake. These machines were named the Martlet Mk IV, and at Boscombe Down testing of the Martlet IV, at 7,350 pounds weight showed a maximum speed of 278 miles per hour at 3,400 feet and 298 miles per hour at 14,600 feet. A maximum climb rate of 1,580 FPM at 6,200 feet at a weight of 7,740 pounds weight, and a time to climb to 20,000 feet of around about 14.5 minutes. The service ceiling being around 30,000 foot with about 8,000 pounds worth of weight. Now, with that said, going back to the Martlet II to the Martlet IV, another thing that was also talked about in a lot of the memoirs that I read was the fact that you had to conserve a lot of your fuel because when it came to actually going off the aircraft carrier and then coming back, a lot of the time they would be in desperate situations when they were trying to land. So therefore a lot of the pilots were told that you should keep or reserve about 20 minutes worth of fuel before you go in for a landing, because you never know what may happen. A lot of these were used in the peninsula near the area of Malta, basically the border between Africa and Europe, you know, that line across there. And with that said, they were quite treacherous early war, especially when you had the North African campaign, which hadn't fully kicked off yet. You obviously had Malta under attack and France falling very quickly, meaning that it put the Royal Navy in the area in quite a awful position. But with the Martlet and many others alongside it, the Royal Navy was able to stand fast, if not get battered along the way. So it is definitely a credit to the Martlet and also the Royal Navy in that area to be able to keep going, to be able to be strong, and it's definitely something I'm going to explore in further videos. Anyway, let's get on to some gameplay. When you look on the face of it, the Martlet Mk IV has a lot going for it. 650 cals at 2.7 is easily enough to dispatch of any enemy. The maneuverability of the aircraft, the elevator being as good as it is, the high speed maneuverability and handling of this aircraft is great. The turning, the combat flaps actually have a really good way of staying around for a long time while you're going around the place. You know, there's a lot going for this aircraft, which makes it really feel like it's going to be good. And then you run into an aerialistic game and you start running into the issues. The main issue with the BR of 2.7 is you either get into a scenario where you are down-tiered by a little bit, or you're up-tiered by a little bit. And when you're down-tiered, the Martlet does obviously pretty well. It's a very good support aircraft, it's a great cleaner-upper, it has a lot of ammunition, and it has good maneuverability to keep up with a lot of those props at those levels, such as the BF-109s and the C-202s, which are incredibly maneuverable. It's able to keep on them and keep annihilating them. It's good at playing defensive because of the maneuverability, and when you are up-tiered, it's the same idea. You are able to play defensively incredibly well. You do have the firepower to dispatch targets, but there is one key difference, and the key difference is climb rate. Climb rate is the make or break thing on, unfortunately, a lot of the aircraft around this BR. And this is because either the general player base is impatient, or it's just a meta that has developed over years. And I think it's just a meta that has gone around. And I thought it would change at some point, but it seems like it's never going to. And it's the issue of climbing against each other for 5 minutes, and then whoever is higher gets the initial advantage. Now, when you're in the Martlet with around about a 12 meters per second climb rate, you're not going to outclimb a BF-109, and you're not going to outclimb anything that the Axis side is going to throw at you, because pretty much all you fight is German and Italian planes. Every so often you'll get a Soviet match, but even then you are in a situation where they're going to outclimb you. So with this said, the Martlet needs a little bit more setup compared to some of its counterparts, such as the Spitfire and even the Typhoon with its engine. So with all that said, you're sat in a situation where first of all you're depending on your team to not stay low and to climb, and then you've got to depend on them to be able to dogfight the enemy in at least a 50-50 state, and while they are coming down, you know, to the ground, once one team gets an advantage or a disadvantage, you have to come in to clean up. You cannot be the person who makes the initial aggressive attack, because you are never on equal ground when you face a BF-109 or a 202 in that scenario that I lined out earlier. And if you don't put yourself in the position after the 5-minute mark where you are there to be able to defensively fly and deal with it, then what you find is you leave your teammates to die, and they all die within the 5 to 7 minute mark, and you are left there hoping that you can maybe clean up 3 to 5 kills. So with this said, it's incredibly hard with the Martlet when you are facing stuff which is outclimbing you because of the meta itself. So if there was a change in the meta, so people wouldn't just meet each other in the middle of the battlefield from the airfield to see who has climbed the highest and to see who has the initial advantage, I feel like it would be an ace plane. It has a ton going for it as an aggressive fighter, as a supportive fighter, as a fighter which is a jack of all trades, but because of this one single thing, it just makes it a pig ass to fly sometimes, because you are playing with teammates who don't know how to fly around you, and that is something you have to expect in any PvP game that you play. But it just can be frustrating when you're sat in a position where you've done everything right, you've maybe got 2 kills on your side, you know, you've cleaned up some of the enemies, and you look at the rest of your team, they've been outclimbed, but they still run into the enemy and they get annihilated within 2 minutes. So you're left with 6 to 7 people against maybe 2 on your side. And it's a very sad state of affairs for the Martlet. But when it comes to individual one-on-one scenarios, it's great, as long as it's on equal ground. The issue is getting to the point where you are on equal ground with your enemy, and it doesn't happen often. I'll definitely say that. It does not happen often that you get a BF-109 or a 202 or a Yak 1B or a 7B on the equal ground as you, but if you are, you can outmaneuver them, you can outturn them, you have great combat flaps, you have great energy retention, you have all of this wonderful stuff. Now, when we talk about the survivability of the Martlet, well, it's pretty much non-existent. The only place which has any damage ability to it is the fuselage, but it is pretty much once you're hit, you're hit. It's very much Spitfire in that sense. This is not an aircraft that can get hit and kind of shrug it off. The Martlet is one where your elevator's either going to fall off, or you're going to take damage to the fuselage, which for some reason makes your wings not be able to work. So you have to set it up so you don't get shot. Now, this is obviously something that you could say about every plane, but there are definitely planes out there where it's much more important that you don't get shot, and the Martlet is one of them for those reasons. The elevator just sometimes decides that it doesn't want to fly anymore. Now, with this said, the old flight model of the F4 was even worse for this. So what would happen is somebody would shoot you in the front, your elevator would fall off, and then you would start doing wonderful loops in the air until you hit the ground. In my experience, the Martlet hasn't had this issue yet, so I'm very, very happy that that is the case. If we talk about how useful it is in ground realistic, well, the first thing you've got to do is say to yourself, right, I'm going to have a 2-7 lineup, because a 3-0 there's no way it makes it in, because you have the Mark IIB Spitfire there, and you also have other machines which can carry bombs as your attacker. So the Martlet is going to have to be a 2-7 machine, so if you're using it at 2-7 in ground realistic, the 50 cals are great. They're great at dispatching planes, you can do a lot of damage to vehicles on the ground. 26mm of pen is enough to go through a lot of stuff on the ground, which is wonderful, especially Panzer IV F2s. You can go through the driver's hatch, and I believe you can also pen the cupola if you get really close. But with that said, it gives you options. It means that you can play the attacker role, you can play the fighter role, and you're not using Hispanos and 7.7s, which are useless against the majority of vehicles that you'll find on the ground. So with that said, there is a use for it in ground realistic, a big use. Also, something that I normally don't bring up, but in simulator, the Martlet is good, because it has really nice controllability. Something that a lot of beginner simulator pilots may look for is a plane which controls really well, and I would point them towards something like a Mustang, or something like a Spitfire. And the reason for this is because they are very forgiving in what goes on. The Martlet is exactly the same way. It's a very, very forgiving aircraft when it comes to this stuff. So hopefully it can be used in that way too. Enduring Confrontation is a wonderful game mode, and if you are looking for something to maybe relax in for a little bit, maybe kill some light ground targets, maybe do some light, fighter on fighter stuff, this is the way to go, in my opinion. So, a plane like this. But when it comes to actual effectiveness in battle, it can be incredibly effective, but it ain't gonna carry a team, because it cannot climb up to the level you need it to. And if you don't get up to the level quick enough that you need, which is around about that 4,000 meter mark, then your team's going to be dead before you can move. And that is the problem with this aircraft. It doesn't have a good enough rate of climb for the meta that finds you in Air Realistic. Overall, I've enjoyed the plane, but I definitely see the downside of it, which is incredibly sad. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.